contradictions and of confusions. Everything which happens in it is unexpected from the very fertility of its lawlessness. There is hardly such a thing as humanity in it. It is peopled by individual souls, and each soul is a species by itself. Is there much practical good, then, in penetrating into the center of that anomalous world? Is there any chance of its vagaries being reduced into a science? Perhaps not. Yet observation will teach us a great deal, and we have hardly a right to say that there is nothing to be said of a region which most men cross in their way to heaven, and which is precisely the region which those who are most capable of perfection cross at its broadest place, and so are longest in crossing. I suppose there are few men in life who have not at times, or once at least, sat down and wondered whether life were worth the living. If we will not let faith speak, there is a great deal to be said on both sides. Faith tyrannizes over the question so completely that it ceases to be a question in her presence. Upon the whole, however, men seem to like life. I infer this not only from their reluctance to part with it, but from their evident zest in living. The most unhappy man I have ever seen, I see him now in my mind's eye, obviously relished his life exceedingly. The least tolerable thing in life is perhaps its monotony. Somehow the life that is fullest of attractions comes to drag at last. Almost all lives have got a lame limb. Nevertheless, if we strike a balance between living and not living, it is in favor of living, with such a surplus that it is not worth while going back to look for errors in our summing. No conceivable errors would put the total the other way. But here's a remarkable thing, that gifted lives are those about which we may most reasonably doubt whether they are worth living. Gifts bring with them an inheritance of pains, as if they were out of place in a fallen world like this. The extreme delicacy of any one sense brings with it more additional annoyances than extra pleasures. Fineness of perception, delicacy of taste, keenness of appreciation, liveliness of imagination, excessive sensitiveness of feeling, all these things bring exquisite pleasures with them. But in a world whose constitution has been deranged by sin, they expose us to continual shocks and jars which often more than counterbalance the enjoyment. This is only what we should expect. Obtuse people feel less than others. They feel sin less, and the disproportionateness of things, and the host of minor evils which haunt life from its beginning to its end. Nevertheless, all these gifts are great helps to perfection. Some spiritual writers have spoken of some of them as if they were indispensable. Certainly, of some of them it is true that where saints have not had them naturally, grace has infused them. It is of one of these things that I am going to speak to you now, a great help or a great hindrance in the spiritual life, a source of peculiar pleasure and a cause of peculiar pain in the natural life. Easily wounded feelings, the gift or the curse of sensitiveness. Sensitiveness is neither a virtue nor a vice, but it is not on that account less intimately connected with the spiritual life. As years go by, their varying circumstances gradually disclose to us depths and peculiarities of our own character, which are deeply concerned with holiness, yet are not in themselves either virtues or vices. They are capabilities of both, and can with equal facility lend themselves to either. They are points in our character at which we begin to go wrong, or at which grace exhibits a predilection to graft itself. Thus, they are strengths as well as weaknesses. Sensitiveness is one of the most important of these things. I do not see how sublime virtue can be reached without it, while on the other hand we behold every day into what depths of incalculable meanness it can plunge great minds, affectionate hearts, and strong characters. It is the secret cause of one half of the disedifying inconsistencies of religious people. It rules us more powerfully than any of our passions. It absorbs our character into itself until it alone almost becomes our character. It makes everything in life exquisite and exaggerated. Our pleasures and our pains are both exquisite. It belongs especially to affectionate dispositions, yet it is not the same thing as tenderness. We must be careful not to confound them. Tenderness comes much nearer to being a virtue, but sensitiveness without tenderness is a very terrible thing. When separated from it, sensitiveness is for the most part allied with cruelty, and cruelty is a complete disability to be a saint. Cruel men are more common than we might have supposed, for modern society exhibits great facilities and conveniences for cruelty. Many men are tyrants in the secret domestic relations of life, who are not only bland and yielding in society, but even charm us by a manifestation of humility, which is not simulated, neither is it altogether unreal. Cruelty and humility often combine very strangely. Nay, what too often is domestic life, because of this cruelty, but a veil behind which lie interminable regions of unhappiness, trodden wildly or trodden wearily by unsuspected thousands every day. Sensitive men are also very quick and keen in their sympathies, but these sympathies are very narrow. Generally speaking, such men can only sympathize with sorrows which they themselves have passed through. Their hearts cannot outgrow the circle of their own experience. They are often not large-hearted men, neither are they forgiving men. There is indeed much narrowness both of mind and heart about sensitiveness, when it is not found in combination with other things. It is always degenerating into umbrageousness, and so darkening the heart, unless that heart is peculiarly blithe and sunny in itself. A man who is sensitive without being elastic is a false character, and will always be found on trial far worse than he seems. Last of all, a sensitive man is generally disinclined to an interior life. Whether it is that all probing is so painful to him that he shrinks from it, or that he has a wider experience than other men of his power of self-delusion, or that he finds outward kindness a charity so difficult to him that he overvalues it, so it is that we mostly find very sensitive men highly impatient of an interior life, and almost inclined to treat it with contempt. It irritates them so strangely that we may be sure there is something in it which is deeply uncongenial to them. At the same time, as we shall see afterwards, sensitiveness confers almost a microscopic power upon the conscience, and so enables us to perceive the finer shades of evil, and to correspond to the more delicate operations of grace. For the present, let this be enough as a general description of sensitiveness and its affinities. It is a common gift in its ordinary degrees, but very uncommon in its highest degrees. But in almost all hearts, the amount of liability to wounded feelings is hardly credible beforehand. It is sufficient completely to obscure our judgment, to deceive our affections, and to make us forget proprieties in our outward demeanor. Men are constantly placing themselves in false and foolish positions under its influence. They can only avoid this either supernaturally through great grace, or naturally through a keen sense of the ridiculous, which is one of our greatest safeguards through life. Sensitiveness is, therefore, on the whole, a common phenomenon in the spiritual life, so common as to justify our making it the subject of a separate investigation. All hearts quiver when they are touched. If some do not, there are only exceptions enough to prove the rule. Piety, if anything, keenly quickens this natural sensitiveness. Indeed, in its earlier stages, it quickens it almost to a morbid extent. This is one of the unlovelinesses which cling about recently converted people. It makes their devotion only a new capability of censoriousness. Thus, the mortification of it becomes one of the primary duties of the spiritual life, and the intense suffering which this causes is the ladder by which we climb higher. Sensitiveness also peculiarly enables us to understand God, to penetrate the meaning of His ways with us, to feel each touch of His grace, to discover the faintest workings of the divine vocation, and to be uneasy under any scarcely perceptible drifting away from His will. We are enabled by it to correspond to the jealousy of God, that jealousy which is a characteristic of His sanctity, and enters so deeply into all His dealings with souls that are aiming at perfection. Sensitiveness also makes us unworldly by continually bringing home to us our unfitness for the world. It is a gift whose dower is suffering, and which therefore makes us pine in our exile, even while it is contributing joys which are the best natural consolations of that exile. It is a source of sanctification, uniting in itself all the four excellences according to which we judge of the importance and efficacy of means of grace. It is constant, it is acute, it is unsuspected, it is fatal to self-love. By unsuspected I mean two things. First, that it goes on sanctifying us even while we are not adverting to the fact, and secondly, that so little delusion adheres to its method of operation that we may trust ourselves to it without suspicion. Last of all, it is a peculiar Christ-like fountain of suffering. Think of the mystery of the agony in the garden. It was a great part of that mystery that therein our dearest Lord put Himself in the place of every one of us. He bore our sins, He identified Himself with our shames. He felt our shrinkings. Our finest sensitiveness is coarse and blunt compared with His. We rudely pressed every one of the quivering keys of His sacred heart, and made it utter the low and plaintive notes of a sorrow beyond our understanding. He shrank like a sensitive plant from the shame with which we covered Him. In the other mysteries of the Passion we have outward pains, external shame, publicity, unkindness, and the desertion of friends. But the suffering of the agony was in no slight degree, and above the other mysteries, the keenness of wounded feelings. To us, therefore, the model and the consolation in our excess of wounded feelings is that most dear and divine heart, whose inward wound finds words in the reproaches of Good Friday.